Hey everyone, my name is Dak. Welcome to my channel. I am retelling stories from the Bible in the best way I know how for you. If you're inspired by stories of faith, love, and redemption, do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe as it helps out a bunch. Thank you, and above all glory is to God. Introduction. What do you do when there's no way out? The Israelites were cornered, an impassable sea in front of them, and Pharaoh's army closing in. Fear gripped their hearts, but Moses stood still, armed only with faith and a wooden staff. What happened next would not only save them, but prove that obstacles aren't barriers, they're setups for God's glory. Could your impossible situation be next? Cornered with no escape. Have you ever been in a situation where every direction looked like a dead end? That sense of helplessness, watching your options vanish one by one, is something the Israelites knew all too well. After escaping Egypt, they found themselves on the edge of the Red Sea. It wasn't just an ordinary predicament, it felt like the end of the road. Behind them, Pharaoh's mighty army advanced swiftly, every chariot wheel kicking up dust, every soldier hell-bent on bringing them back into slavery. Ahead of them, the sea stretched endlessly, as if mocking their hope for freedom. Escape seemed impossible. For a moment, everything, their newfound hope, their freedom, and their faith, hung in the balance. The panic among the Israelites was overwhelming. They were not soldiers or tacticians, just a mass of former slaves, tired from their journey and defenseless against what was coming. It was more than just the sight of Pharaoh's chariots that terrified them. These were the 600 chosen chariots, and all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers over all of them. The most advanced military power of their time was barreling down toward a group of people with no weapons, no training, and no way out. Their fear wasn't rooted in strategy or logic, it was survival instinct taking over. They must have thought, this is how it ends. As the sound of hoofbeats thundered closer, the tension rose. You could almost hear their breath quicken, their thoughts racing wildly in desperation. Cries, half in anger and half in despair, began to rise. Why did God bring us here? Was this all a mistake? It was as if their faith cracked under the weight of their terror. They turned on Moses, their leader, the one who had brought them to this baffling moment. Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? It was biting, a bitter lament that revealed more than just frustration. It was full of raw fear. In their minds, this wasn't freedom, it was a cruel trap. The fear wasn't just about what was behind them, it was about the overwhelming sense that there was no future ahead of them. The geography pressed in on them like the jaws of a trap. The sea cut them off from forward motion, and Pharaoh's army blocked any hope of retreat. The place where they were encamped, by Pihahiroth, in front of Baal-zephon, felt like it gave no quarter. No one could dive into the sea and survive. No one could outrun the chariots bearing down behind them. From every angle they were cornered. If you've ever felt trapped, you can understand their panic. Maybe you've been in a situation where your resources, your health, or even your relationships felt like they were closing in on you, where nothing you tried seemed to open a way out. That's where the Israelites were, at rock bottom. It wasn't just the limits of their strength, it was the limits of their belief. It was the perfect setup for despair to take over. The noise of the chariots only grew louder, deafeningly close now. The people's cries of fear must have echoed across the camp. But fear has a way of narrowing your perspective, of drawing your eyes solely to the problem in front of you. In the midst of the chaos, Moses stood. He wasn't panicked. In fact, he seemed firm in a way that would have frustrated or confused the people. While everyone else saw no possibilities, Moses raised his voice above the noise, not just the noise of the chariots or the cries, but the overwhelming roar of fear. This leader, this man of faith, held his ground. He didn't have a mighty army or a secret escape plan. All he had was faith in the promise of God. The Israelites' fear made them question everything: God, Moses' leadership, even the purpose of their entire journey. Fear magnifies doubt, but Moses' response was steady and assured. You have to imagine what it took for him to stand there, calm while the world seemed to collapse around him. It wasn't that he didn't feel the weight of the moment. He must have, but he chose to act out of trust instead of terror. Fear, real fear, clouds everything. For the Israelites, it made them question whether they had been better off in Egypt. It distorted the deliverance they'd already experienced. It made them see slavery as preferable to stepping into the unknown. That's what fear does. It shrinks our perspective until even our past chains look appealing just because they're familiar. But while their fear made them imagine the worst, Moses' faith lifted his eyes to God. He didn't minimize the problem, but he knew it wasn't the end of the story. This wasn't the moment to retreat, it was the moment to stand. Moses' response in that critical moment was a deep contrast to the panic of the people. Faith standing firm in a sea of fear. His words came like a strong wind cutting through the chaos. Fear not, stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. It wasn't just encouragement, it was an invitation to shift their focus. Fear had pressed their eyes on the approaching disaster, but Moses was redirecting their vision upward. But how could Moses stand there, calm in the face of chaos? What made him believe that this wasn't the end? The truth is, faith doesn't often come with a blueprint for what's next. Moses didn't give them a detailed plan. His confidence didn't come from knowing the exact logistics of their deliverance, but from knowing the God who had promised it. It's not hard to imagine the skepticism in the crowd. After all, they stood at the edge of the sea with no visible way forward. When fear presses in, faith can look foolish. Yet it was clear, even then, that faith was the only real response to the impossible. Standing there that day, holding nothing but his staff, Moses embodied the very nature of faith. He didn't turn back to plead with Pharaoh. He didn't try to negotiate or scramble for another solution. He stood still, confident in what he couldn't yet see. It was here, at this breaking point, with hearts racing and the army closing in, that God was setting the stage. Fear might have been gripping their hearts, but it was also creating a canvas, something God would use to demonstrate his power. The Israelites couldn't have known it yet, but the very sea they saw as a wall blocking their escape would soon become the highway God used to save them. The moments before a breakthrough often look like disaster. While the Israelites saw a dead end, God saw an opportunity to show them who He really was. What could possibly save them now? Their questions, their doubt, their complaints, all of it hung in the air. But sometimes fear is part of the setup for an even greater work. Moses responded to their panic not with a solution they could see, but with faith anchored in the unseen. Fear is loud and urgent, but faith, true faith, gives room for God to act in ways no one can predict. So everything paused for a moment. The chariots were coming closer, the sea was still in front of them, and people were still shouting in fear. Yet Moses stood firm, hands gripping his staff, eyes steady on the God who brought them to this very place. What came next wasn't just an escape from an impossible situation, it was the kind of moment that redefined what faith could accomplish. Fear had cornered them, but faith was about to set them free. How does faith respond when moving forward seems impossible? Faith in the face of fear. Could you stand still and trust when everything around you feels like chaos? That's the question the Israelites faced as they stood trapped before the Red Sea. The panic was suffocating. The sound of Pharaoh's army approaching, the waves lapping against the shore, the cries of the crowd echoing through the camp. Yet, in the middle of this turmoil, Moses stepped forward and spoke with a faith that seemed almost out of place. Do not be afraid, stand firm, and you will see the deliverance of the Lord. Those words must have cut through the noise like a sharp blade, but how could they believe such a bold promise when there wasn't a clear way out in sight? Imagine the weight of Moses' words in that moment. All eyes were on him, and all he had were words of trust in a God they couldn't see. Behind him, the Egyptians advanced with relentless power. Their chariots and soldiers, armed with everything Pharaoh could muster, were the physical representation of their worst fears. In front of them, the sea stretched endlessly, an impassable wall of water. Death seemed imminent, and yet Moses didn't waver. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent. His confidence wasn't just in himself. It wasn't in the staff he carried or in any hidden plan he might have been working on. It rested fully on God. But imagine being one of the Israelites, hearing those words while chaos closed in. What keeps you rooted when nothing about the situation feels safe? Faith, real faith, often looks foolish before the miracle happens. Have you ever noticed that? When you're standing in the middle of a storm, trusting that God will make a way seems almost unimaginable. That's the kind of faith Moses displayed, a trust that seemed unreasonable in the moment. Did Moses know exactly what God was going to do? Probably not. There's no indication that he had a detailed roadmap or a preview of how the events would unfold. What he did have was a deep assurance in God's ability to deliver them. It wasn't blind optimism, it was a practiced trust born from knowing who God is. In this moment, God gave Moses an instruction that didn't come with an explanation. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea. There were no guarantees laid out in advance, no diagram of what would happen next. It required action before understanding, faith before sight. Just think about what that must have seemed like to the Israelites, watching Moses respond to an impossible situation with what seemed like such a small gesture, a wooden staff stretched out over an unyielding sea. How could that possibly make a difference? The contrast between Moses and the Israelites couldn't have been more stark. While the people were consumed by fear, questioning, and doubt, Moses' faith stood firm. The difference wasn't in their circumstances. They were all facing the same enemy and staring at the same sea. The difference was in their response to the situation. The people saw barriers, while Moses trusted that God could create a path. It's worth considering how often fear can narrow our perspective, while faith opens it back up. If we think about it, this is one of the hardest parts of faith, stepping forward before the ground is visible. If you know for certain how things will work out, faith almost doesn't feel necessary. It's only when there's no human solution that faith truly activates something greater. In the Israelites' eyes, standing there waiting on God must have felt absurd. Every second they hesitated brought Pharaoh's army closer. Every moment that passed seemed to shrink their chances of survival. And yet Moses' faith wasn't passive. His standing firm wasn't about doing nothing. It was an active choice to trust in what he knew about God's nature, even while nothing in his surroundings confirmed it. Isn't that often the nature of trust? In our own lives, sometimes it feels easiest to only trust God after we have evidence of His provision, after we've already seen the outcome. But what happens when He calls us to take a step before the sea parts? The most significant moments of trust often come before we understand the full picture. Moses didn't know every detail of what God would do, but he didn't need to. His faith wasn't rooted in outcomes, it was rooted in God's character. Sometimes it's not about knowing what will happen, it's about knowing who holds the situation in his hands. The miracle of the Red Sea was about to unfold, but the true work had already begun the moment Moses raised his staff. That small act of obedience was a declaration of trust in action. It reminds us that faith isn't just a feeling, it's something you practice and live out, even when the path forward isn't clear. It's easy to celebrate faith once the victory comes, but this moment right before the sea began to part, is where the real challenge lies. You have to wonder what the Israelites were thinking as they watched Moses lift that staff. Did they expect him to say something more? Did they still doubt as the waters looked unchanged? Trust often feels stretched to its breaking point in these moments, when it seems like nothing is shifting. That's where faith becomes a test, not in the safety of certainty, but in the vulnerability of uncertainty. And yet that's how God works. He doesn't always provide explanations in advance. Standing still and trusting doesn't mean you're doing nothing. It means you're aligning your heart with the reality that God moves in His timing and His power. Moses' words weren't just commands, they were invitations. Stand firm and see the deliverance of the Lord wasn't passive, it was anticipation, an expectation that God was about to act. But that anticipation required stillness first. It required quiet trust in the midst of chaos. As Moses stood on the sandy ground, facing the waves and holding his staff, The scene seemed impossible by human standards. The odds were stacked so high against them that it might have felt ridiculous to believe anything could change. But faith doesn't need favorable odds. If anything, it thrives in situations that seem most impossible, because that's where God's power is displayed most clearly. Trust that deep, that willing to seem foolish, often precedes God's most extraordinary work. What happens when faith meets action? That's when things begin to shift. But it's important to remember that the act itself, the raising of the staff, wasn't about human ability. It wasn't about Moses as a leader or about the strength of the Israelites. It was, and always had been, about God. Faith isn't about moving the obstacle ourselves. It's about stepping aside enough to let God show what only He can do. It's not that the sea was easy to cross. It's that God was mighty enough to make a way where there was none. Faith makes room for God to act, and in that moment, that's exactly what Moses was doing. He wasn't solving the problem, and he wasn't asking the Israelites to do the impossible. He was simply bringing them to the point where they could witness God's power firsthand. His statement, "The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent," wasn't a command to do nothing. It was a call to stop striving out of fear and start trusting out of faith. And then there was that pause, that moment where nothing looked different yet, but faith was already in motion. The waters hadn't shifted, the chariots hadn't stopped, and yet everything was already changing. That's the tension of faith, that it acts before the outcome is visible, trusting that God is faithful to complete the work He's promised. Faith doesn't ignore the danger or pretend it's not there, but it acknowledges a greater reality, a God who is capable of far more than we dare to imagine. The next step would defy all logic. By all accounts, the Red Sea should have been an impossible barrier. But that's the thing about faith, it's not bound by human logic. This wasn't just a story of escape, it was about God revealing His power in a way that would leave no room for doubt. Moses' act of faith had aligned with God's timing, and the foundation had been laid for the unimaginable to unfold. The sea loomed large, but so did God's promise. Something extraordinary was about to happen. When the sea becomes a path, what kind of power does it take to turn a barrier into a breakthrough? As the Israelites stood paralyzed between the Red Sea and Pharaoh's advancing army, it seemed as though the story would end in defeat. But then Moses stretched out his hand over the water. That simple act might have looked insignificant at first, but it marked the start of something astonishing. The impossible began to unfold as a strong east wind swept across the sea, blowing steadily through the night. This was not an instantaneous miracle, but a deliberate, unfolding act of divine power. Bit by bit, the waters began to draw back, creating a path where none had been before. Imagine what it must have been like to stand there under the night sky, feeling the wind whip through the camp. The roar of the waves breaking apart drowned out some of the fear-fueled murmurs that had gripped the people earlier. Slowly but surely, the sea transformed. Walls of water rose on either side, held firmly in place as if by unseen hands. The seabed itself emerged, not muddy and treacherous, but dry ground, a pathway stretching from one shore to the other. This wasn't just a physical escape route, it was a miracle so dramatic that it left no room to question who was behind it. The power to divide an entire sea didn't come from human ingenuity, it was a clear and undeniable demonstration of God's ability to do what no one else could. As dawn broke, the Israelites must have stared at the sight before them in awe. The air was still thick with tension, but their eyes now reflected something new, wonder and disbelief. This was a moment no one could have imagined, a moment that shattered the limitations they had placed on their faith. Many had spent the night questioning whether God had brought them this far only to let them be destroyed. But now they were face to face with the unimaginable. The same God who had led them with a pillar of cloud and fire had made a way through what seemed like an impassable obstacle. The sea had not disappeared, it had been transformed into a living testament to His power. Throughout this miraculous event, God's protection never wavered. That pillar of cloud and fire, which had guided them so faithfully, shifted positions. It moved behind the Israelites, standing as a barrier between them and Pharaoh's army. Scripture describes how this divine presence provided light to the Israelites while casting darkness over the Egyptians. It was as though God Himself was holding the enemy at bay, ensuring no harm could come to His people during the critical hours of their escape. Every detail of this rescue effort seemed orchestrated to remind them, and generations to come, that God's power operates on a level beyond human comprehension. Now imagine standing at the edge of that newly formed path. The walls of water towered on either side, restless and teeming, yet held back by a force greater than nature. The seabed stretched ahead, firm and strangely dry beneath their feet. It must have taken incredible courage to take that first step. Would the waters hold? Would the enemy catch up before they reached the other side? Fear likely lingered in their minds, but each step forward was a testament to a growing faith, faith that God didn't just part the sea, but would see them through to safety. It's easy to overlook just how much faith was required in that moment. The miracle of the parted sea wasn't the end of their journey, it was the beginning of a passage they had to walk. Trust didn't stop with witnessing the miracle, it had to carry them across the seabed, step by step. With Pharaoh's army still pursuing behind them, hesitating wasn't an option. Each family, every child and elder, had to make the decision to move forward, placing one foot in front of the other despite the uncertainty. The miracle of the parted sea wasn't just about escape, it was a powerful message that nothing is impossible for God. The Israelites had spent their entire lives in bondage, experiencing daily reminders of their limitations. Their understanding of freedom and possibility had been shaped by the harsh realities of slavery. In many ways, the Red Sea represented more than just a physical barrier, it symbolized every challenge they believed they couldn't overcome. By turning that barrier into a pathway, God was showing them and us that His power knows no bounds. He doesn't remove obstacles to make life easier, He transforms obstacles into avenues for His glory. As the Israelites journeyed through this miraculous passage, the sheer scale of what they were experiencing must have left them breathless. Every glance at the towering walls of water was a reminder of the God who had made this moment possible. This wasn't just an escape from Pharaoh's army, it was an invitation to deepen their trust in the God who had promised to deliver them. Under any normal circumstances, those walls of water would have been deadly, but in God's hands, even the most chaotic forces of nature became instruments of salvation. But even as they pressed forward, the situation wasn't fully resolved. Behind them, Pharaoh's army hadn't given up. The presence of chariots and soldiers drawing closer still posed a very real threat, yet the pillar of cloud and fire continued to hold the enemy back, giving the Israelites the time they needed to cross. The sea was more than a route to freedom, it was a demonstration of God's faithfulness, protecting His people on all sides as they moved toward the promise of safety. By the time the last Israelite set foot on the opposite shore, they must have felt their fear begin to shift into something else, relief certainly, gratitude perhaps, but more than anything, a new kind of trust. The Red Sea wasn't just about being delivered from their enemies, it was about experiencing, in the most tangible way possible, the power and presence of God. And yet, even with one of the most incredible miracles of all time unfolding before their eyes, the story wasn't over. The Egyptians were still chasing them, and the final chapter of this confrontation had yet to be written. Standing on the far shore, the Israelites would soon witness an entirely different aspect of God's power. The sea, which had served as their refuge, would soon become Pharaoh's undoing. But before that moment arrived, they had already experienced something that would shape their understanding of God forever. This wasn't just about survival, it was about transformation. They had walked through what should have been impossible. They had seen the physical evidence of God's power holding back the forces of nature. Whatever doubts they carried into this journey, whatever fears had gripped their hearts when they stood cornered at the water's edge, had now been overshadowed by one undeniable truth: God had made a way where there was none. This moment gives us a picture of how God works in our lives. The obstacles we see as insurmountable aren't there to stop us, they're there to display His glory. The Red Sea wasn't removed, it was parted. Instead of taking the Israelites around it, God led them through it. That's a pattern that holds true even today. When we face situations that seem impossible, it's often not about avoiding the challenge, but stepping into it, trusting that God can turn it into something far greater than we could imagine. The crossing of the Red Sea teaches us that God doesn't just rescue us from danger, He shows us who He is in the process. Each step the Israelites took through that seabed was a step deeper into trusting the God who promised to deliver them. The sea wasn't simply a backdrop for this miracle, it became a canvas for God's divine intervention. The waters, split and towering, weren't just proof of His power, they were declarations of his commitment to his people. But even as the Israelites began to realize the magnitude of what had happened, they couldn't yet rest. Pharaoh's army wasn't slowing down. The path through the sea hadn't just been their route to freedom, it was also about to reveal something even greater: the certainty of God's victory over their enemy. This moment gives us a picture of how God works in our lives. The obstacles we see as insurmountable aren't there to stop us, they're there to display His glory. The Red Sea wasn't removed, it was parted. Instead of taking the Israelites around it, God led them through it. That's a pattern that holds true even today. When we face situations that seem impossible, it's often not about avoiding the challenge, but stepping into it, trusting that God can turn it into something far greater than we could imagine. The crossing of the Red Sea teaches us that God doesn't just rescue us from danger, He shows us who He is in the process. Each step the Israelites took through that seabed was a step deeper into trusting the God who promised to deliver them. The sea wasn't simply a backdrop for this miracle, it became a canvas for God's divine intervention. The waters, split and towering, weren't just proof of His power, they were declarations of His commitment to His people. But even as the Israelites began to realize the magnitude of what had happened, they couldn't yet rest. Pharaoh's army wasn't slowing down. The path through the sea hadn't just been their route to freedom, it was also about to reveal something even greater: the certainty of God's victory over their enemy. The enemy's final pursuit. What happens when the enemy thinks they've won, only to walk straight into a trap? That's exactly what Pharaoh's army did when they charged into the sea. After the waters had parted and the Israelites had begun to cross, Pharaoh's confidence remained unshaken. To him, the miracle before his eyes wasn't a sign of God's power, but an opportunity to assert his own. He believed his might, his chariots, his soldiers, his sheer determination could overtake the God of Israel. It was arrogance in its purest form, a stubborn refusal to acknowledge a force greater than himself. Scripture tells us that Pharaoh's change of heart had been fierce. When the Israelites left Egypt, it wasn't long before Pharaoh and his officials regretted their decision. "What is this we have done, that we have let Israel go from serving us?" they lamented. Their pursuit wasn't just about reclaiming a group of slaves, it was about restoring Pharaoh's reputation and power, both of which had been wounded by the plagues. Every act of defiance against Moses and every display of arrogance against God was rooted in Pharaoh's attempt to preserve his authority. Now, as his army rode into the seabed, the same hardness of heart would lead to their downfall. The Israelites, having barely escaped the oppressive grasp of Egypt, must have felt that familiar wave of panic return as they looked back. It wasn't just the sound of chariot wheels or the glint of weapons in the distance, it was the realization that the very oppressors they thought they'd left behind were still pursuing them. Imagine walking through a path flanked by walls of water, taking each careful step on dry ground while your enemy advances behind you. The threat isn't over, the fear isn't gone. Even though they were in the middle of a miracle, their hearts must have trembled. Could they make it to the other side before the Egyptians caught up? Was Pharaoh's army unstoppable, even here? Meanwhile, Pharaoh's pride grew bolder with every stride his army made into the sea. He ordered his chariots to follow, confident they would catch the Israelites soon enough. This arrogance wasn't just personal. Pharaoh's pursuit symbolized a deeper conflict, a clash between human power and divine sovereignty. It was as if he believed his authority could rival God's, that his wealth, military strength, and ambition might be enough to overpower what was happening. Pharaoh's confidence reflected humanity's tendency to resist surrendering control, even when faced with the undeniable works of God. But God's strategy wasn't to stop Pharaoh's army immediately. Instead, he allowed the Egyptians to follow Israel into the seabed. This was no accident or oversight, it was part of a larger plan. Scripture reveals a deeper purpose. "I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they shall go in after them, and I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host, his chariots, and his horsemen." God wasn't just leading the Israelites out of Egypt, He was using Pharaoh's arrogance as the very means to display his power. By letting the Egyptians pursue, God was exposing the futility of their efforts. He wasn't simply providing a rescue, he was delivering a message that would echo through generations. The pursuit itself became a stage for God's ultimate victory, but in the moment, the Israelites likely couldn't see that. Their fear must have risen again as they glanced behind them, catching sight of the enemy closing in. Even with the parted waters on either side, they still needed to trust that God would protect them until the end. It's a reminder that even when we're walking in the middle of a miracle, our faith can still waver. Miracles don't always remove fear. They invite us to trust God despite it. God's intervention didn't wait until the Egyptians reached the Israelites. As Pharaoh's army charged forward, the pillar of fire and cloud that had guided the Israelites now shifted behind them. It stood as a barrier between Israel and Egypt, providing light to one side and darkness to the other. This division wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. God was actively protecting his people, making it clear that no power, not even Egypt's most formidable army, could touch what he had chosen to defend. The Israelites might have felt exposed, but they weren't. The same God who parted the sea was still with them, still shielding them. But Pharaoh and his army didn't stop. Even as they entered the divided waters, even as the ground remained impossibly dry beneath their chariot wheels, they pressed forward. What must have been going through their minds? Did they feel invincible, emboldened by their numbers and their weapons? Did they convince themselves that somehow their pursuit would succeed despite the inexplicable events surrounding them? Whatever thoughts drove them forward, they couldn't see the trap God had set. As the Egyptian army advanced deeper into the sea, something shifted. The Lord looked down on the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and cloud and threw the Egyptian forces into a panic, clogging their chariot wheels so that they drove heavily. What had been an awe-inspiring road for the Israelites became treacherous for Pharaoh's army. Suddenly the ground wasn't so firm, and the wheels of their chariots began to falter. The chaos of the moment must have unraveled every thread of confidence they had brought with them. They cried out, "Let us flee from before Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians." In that moment of realization, they finally saw what Pharaoh's pride had blinded them to for so long. The God of Israel was not a force to be challenged. He was not merely freeing his people, he was dismantling the very foundation of Egypt's power, exposing its limits, and demonstrating his own sovereignty in unmistakable ways. The delay in the Egyptians' defeat wasn't a mistake. God's strategy was deliberate. By allowing them to chase the Israelites into the sea, he fully revealed their arrogance, their inability to recognize his authority, and ultimately, their helplessness. Sometimes God seems to delay the final blow for this very purpose, to ensure that his victory is absolute and undeniable, leaving no room for the enemy to claim even a partial success. Deliverance isn't just about survival, it's about showing that God reigns supreme. As the Egyptians reached the midpoint of their pursuit, the stage was set for what would happen next. The Israelites, having crossed to the other side, watched from safety as the sea began to shift again. The walls of water that had stood firm during their escape now churned and roared. God's power was about to bring the story to its climactic conclusion, not just saving his people, but destroying the threat that had loomed over them for so many generations. Pharaoh's army, so confident, so determined, now found themselves exposed. Their weapons couldn't save them, their chariots couldn't carry them to victory, and their plans couldn't outmaneuver God's divine strategy. It became brutally clear that no human power, no matter how strong or ambitious, could stand before a God who parts seas and protects his people. This moment wasn't just about the destruction of an army. It was a declaration that the forces of oppression and evil would no longer have power over God's chosen people. Generations of slavery, suffering, and fear were swallowed up alongside Pharaoh's chariots. The Israelites weren't just running from something, they were stepping into freedom, watching as the God who had called them out of Egypt proved he would also fight for their deliverance. And yet this was about more than physical safety. It was about transformation. The Red Sea wasn't just an escape route, it was a place of revelation. The Israelites came to see in a way they never had before that their God wasn't limited by the laws of nature or the strength of their enemies. He was the God who made a path where none existed and who used the very sea they had feared to secure their freedom. By the time the waters closed, Pharaoh's pursuit had come to an irreversible end. The enemy wasn't just stopped, it was undone. Sometimes God allows the enemy to press in, to seem unstoppable, so that his victory is even more complete. Pharaoh's army didn't just fail, they were exposed for what they were, no match for the power of God. What began with arrogance and boldness ended in fear and defeat. The Israelites' journey wasn't just about escaping the grip of Egypt, it was about stepping into a new identity. They weren't merely a group of freed slaves, they were a people who had witnessed firsthand the unstoppable power of God. And what lay before them now wasn't just the chance to survive, it was the invitation to trust. The sea closes and the enemy falls. Why didn't the sea close the moment the Israelites stepped onto dry ground? Surely it would have been quicker, safer, and less terrifying to seal off the waters as soon as God's people had crossed. But God's timing is never careless. Every second matters in His plan, and this moment was no exception. The waters remained parted, towering as walls on either side as Pharaoh's army stormed in after the Israelites. This wasn't just hesitation, it was a deliberate delay that allowed God's plan to reach its full conclusion. It wasn't enough for the Israelites to merely escape. Their freedom needed to be definitive, unchallenged, and undeniable. As Pharaoh's soldiers charged deeper into the miraculous pathway, the tone of the moment started to shift. The Israelites, now safely on the opposite shore, must have looked back with both relief and dread. Relief because they had crossed to safety, dread because their oppressors were relentlessly following them into the path God had created. Were they truly free, if their enemy could travel the same road? Their elation at reaching the other side was likely tinged with lingering fear, a fear that perhaps Egypt still held too much power. And then it happened. Scripture tells us, "So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its normal course when the morning appeared. And as the Egyptians fled into it, the Lord threw the Egyptians into the midst of the sea." The same waters that had parted to save God's people now rushed back with unstoppable force. The towering walls collapsed inward, covering the seabed in a surge of waves. Pharaoh's army, those symbols of fear and oppression, disappeared beneath the waters, leaving no trace behind. It's important to pause here and reflect on how carefully timed this act was. From a human perspective, allowing the Egyptian forces to pursue the Israelites into the seabed must have seemed risky. Why let them get that close? Why not seal off the waters earlier, as soon as God's people had made it through? But God doesn't operate on human timelines or with human fears. His timing wasn't just about safety, it was about revelation. By allowing the Egyptians to enter the miraculous path, he wasn't just rescuing the Israelites, he was making a statement. Pharaoh and his army didn't just fail in their pursuit, they were entirely undone. It wasn't enough to suppress the enemy, they had to see that their power was no match for God's. For those watching from the shore, the moment must have been overwhelming. The oppressive force that had loomed over them for generations, not just in this moment of pursuit, but in the years of slavery that came before, was gone. Their oppressors had vanished, swallowed up by the same sea that had been their escape. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Exodus 14:30. The finality of that moment must have struck them deeply. What had once seemed so powerful, so immovable, was revealed as fragile before the God who fights for his people. Witnessing the sea close wasn't just a turning point in the narrative, it was the closing of a chapter in their identity. In Egypt they had been slaves, and Pharaoh had been their master. Even when they stepped into the seabed, fleeing for their lives, the weight of that identity lingered. But as the waters returned and Pharaoh's army fell, something shifted. The Israelites were not just leaving Egypt physically, they were being set free in a way that redefined them entirely. They were no longer slaves running from bondage, they were a people set apart, rescued by the hand of God Himself. What must it have felt like for the Israelites to finally realize they were free, to watch the same army that had oppressed them for so long disappear under the waves? It wasn't just about survival, it was about transformation. The waters didn't just shield them physically, they severed a link to their past. That moment wasn't merely a rescue, it was a declaration. The enemy they'd feared, the one they thought would pursue them forever, was no more. The Egyptians whom you see today you shall never see again. Exodus 14:13. That promise came to life before their eyes in a way they could not have anticipated. For the Egyptians, this moment also carried its own message. Their pursuit had begun with arrogance and strength. Pharaoh's army, equipped with chariots and weapons, believed they could crush a fleeing group of unarmed slaves. But that arrogance dissolved in panic when the waters began to close. The Lord threw the Egyptians into the midst of the sea, and what had been a confident march became chaos. The soldiers tried to flee, crying out, "Let us flee from before Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians." Exodus 14:25. But by the time they understood the reality of who they were up against, it was too late. Their power, their chariots, their numbers, none of it mattered. When they entered the path God had reserved for his people, they sealed their own fate. The Israelites weren't just witnessing the destruction of an enemy, they were witnessing a confirmation of who God is. Watching Pharaoh's army fall wasn't just about seeing an oppressor defeated, it was about seeing the sovereignty and justice of God displayed in full. This was more than physical freedom, it was a spiritual declaration that God alone holds power over heaven and earth. Pharaoh had spent generations defying God, treating himself as if he were divine, but in this final act, even his greatest force crumbled before the Creator. For the Israelites, the return of the sea was the ultimate assurance that their past no longer had power over them. They had been slaves, yes, but no more. The oppressor they had feared for so long was gone, and with it went the weight of their bondage. This moment wasn't just about escaping Egypt, it was about stepping fully into their identity as God's people. The path through the sea had been miraculous, but the closure of the sea was decisive. God's deliverance didn't leave their enemy wounded or in retreat, it left them utterly defeated. This is the kind of deliverance that leaves no room for doubt. Sometimes, when God delivers us, he does so in a way that makes it impossible for the old chains to bind us again. The Egyptians weren't just stopped, they were erased from the equation entirely. That's the kind of victory God offers, the kind that ensures the past cannot return to reclaim us. As the Israelites stood on the shore, the realization must have washed over them in waves, just like the sea that had swallowed their oppressors. Their cries of fear had been replaced with awe. Their doubts about whether God had brought them to this place to die were silenced by the sight of his power. What they faced now wasn't a return to anything they had known before, it was an entirely new beginning. The victory at the Red Sea didn't just rescue the Israelites from danger, it transformed their understanding of God. Israel saw the great power that the Lord used against the Egyptians, so the people feared the Lord and they believed in the Lord and his servant Moses. Exodus 14:31. That fear wasn't terror, it was reverence. They had seen firsthand the unstoppable might of the God who fought for them. This wasn't just a rescue mission, it was the start of a relationship built on trust. This moment also set the tone for how they would view God in the days, months, and years to come. The Red Sea wasn't just a singular event, it became a marker, a moment they could look back on whenever doubts or fears crept in. It was proof that the God who makes a way through the sea would continue to lead them forward. The closing of the sea wasn't the last miracle they would experience, but it was one of the clearest demonstrations of God's sovereignty. It wasn't just about defeating Pharaoh or securing freedom, it was about showing both the Israelites and the nations around them that God reigned supreme. This was about far more than survival, it was about their transformation into a people who would carry God's promises into the future. And so, as the waters settled back into place and the sounds of Pharaoh's army faded, the Israelites stood on the other side of the sea with something they hadn't had before, a deep, unshakable awareness of God's power. Their journey wasn't over, but their past no longer held them in its grip. God had finished what he started, and their freedom was complete. A song of celebration and faith. How do you respond when you've witnessed a miracle firsthand? For the Israelites, the moment they saw the walls of water close over Pharaoh's army and realized they were truly free, words weren't enough. Their reaction wasn't quiet relief or hushed thanks. It was an eruption of praise so powerful that it became one of the most memorable worship moments in all of Scripture. Exodus 15 records their response as the Song of the Sea, a hymn of joy and celebration that declared everything they had just seen and felt. After years of oppression, centuries of backbreaking slavery, and days of fear so intense they could barely breathe, they finally released their voices in gratitude, awe, and faith. It wasn't just a song, it was the first time they stood together as free people, united under the God who had fought for them. This wasn't a planned moment. You can feel the raw emotion in the song, the way it sprung up naturally as their first response to God's deliverance. Millions of voices rose as they declared, "The Lord is my strength and my song, and he has become my salvation." Can you imagine that moment? Standing on the shore, the waves still crashing in the distance, their oppressors gone forever. What else could they do but worship? The very same sea that had terrified them only hours before was now a reminder of God's power to save. This wasn't just about what God had done, it was about what this meant for them as a people. They sang, not as slaves, but as a nation, a people called, loved, and protected by the Lord. Some of the most striking parts of the song are how directly it names God's role in their deliverance. They didn't try to attribute this victory to Moses or their own actions. The words of the song left no question about who deserved credit. Your right hand, O Lord, glorious in power, your right hand, O Lord, shatters the enemy. This wasn't just gratitude for being rescued, it was an outright confession of God's power and authority. Everything about the song lifted their eyes above their immediate circumstances and focused on who God was. The song declared his strength, his justice, and his faithfulness to keep his promises. Imagine what it must have been like for the Israelites to sing these words together. This was more than just an emotional reaction, it was a collective statement of who they now understood God to be. After generations of slavery in Egypt, where Pharaoh and his false gods were worshipped as ultimate powers, the Israelites were finally recognizing that their God was greater than any earthly king. Their song even called out Pharaoh's arrogance. The enemy said, "I will pursue, I will overtake, I will divide the spoil, but you blew with your wind and the sea covered them." In just a few lines they recounted the oppression they had lived under, the danger they had faced, and the way God had turned it all upside down. But the song didn't just stay in the past. One of the beautiful things about the Song of the Sea is that it looked forward. This wasn't a one-time celebration of what had already happened. It was a proclamation of what God was going to do. They declared, "You will bring them in and plant them on your own mountain, the place, O Lord, which you have made for your abode." They sang about the future promise of the promised land, even though it still lay far ahead in the distance. Standing on the other side of the Red Sea, they didn't know what challenges awaited them in the wilderness, but for that moment their faith was crystal clear. They trusted that the same God who had parted the sea would guide them to the land he had promised. This moment wasn't just about the words they sang, it was about what the act of singing meant. Worship is often our natural response to God's goodness. It's what happens when we're overwhelmed by His power, love, or provision. And that's exactly what we see with the Israelites here. Singing that song together wasn't just a moment of celebration, it became an anchor for their faith. When future challenges came, when they faced doubt or fear in the wilderness, they could remember this moment. They could recall the words they had sung and the truths they had declared about who God was. Worship like this solidifies what God has done in our hearts, reminding us that even when circumstances change, He doesn't. For many of the Israelites, this song likely became the sweetest expression of freedom they had ever known. Let's not forget the emotion behind it. This wasn't a calm, rehearsed hymn sung out of obligation. This was an outpouring of gratitude released after centuries of unspeakable pain. These were people who had watched their children grow up in slavery, who had lived every day under the weight of Pharaoh's cruelty. The relief they must have felt as they sang, knowing that their oppressors would never return, must have been overwhelming. It was more than just freedom from physical chains. They were tasting spiritual freedom, freedom to trust and depend on God instead of living under fear. Can we learn something from their example? Often, in moments of breakthrough, we feel an incredible sense of relief or gratitude, but how often does it lead us into worship? Worship can feel like a natural extension of joy in moments of victory, but it's also a choice. It's a practice that directs our focus upward, away from ourselves and toward the one responsible for our deliverance. When the Israelites sang that God was their strength, their song, and their salvation, they were claiming something personal. It wasn't just an abstract acknowledgement of his power. They recognized him as the one who sustained them, who fought for them, and who transformed their story. Worship isn't something we do only for God, it also changes us. It reminds us of His faithfulness and reshapes how we carry that into the next season of life. Looking back at the Song of the Sea, you can't miss how it became a turning point for the Israelites. As Moses and the people sang, Miriam, Moses' sister, led the women with tambourines, dancing, and repeating lines of the song. The worship spilled over from words into action. They couldn't stay still. They couldn't sing praises without their bodies moving in celebration. This wasn't simply a religious ritual, it was a full body expression of joy, a release after years of bondage that translated into uninhibited celebration. Their worship wasn't just about formality, it was about freedom. It was about letting their gratitude take every form, unashamedly offering praise to the God who had set them free. But this moment wasn't just about celebrating the past, it was about preparing for the future. Their journey was far from over. They wouldn't step into the promised land the next day or even the next month. The wilderness lay ahead, filled with challenges that would test their faith in ways they couldn't yet imagine. How would they face hunger, thirst, and uncertainty? How would they respond when their trust in God was tested again and again? It's telling that their first step after deliverance was worship. It shows us that worship grounds us. It reminds us of who God is, what He has already done, and what He will continue to do ahead of us. Gratitude strengthens faith, and faith is what carries us through the wilderness. What about you? Have there been times in your life when God brought you through something you thought you'd never overcome? Did you pause to worship, to acknowledge His hand in your deliverance? The Song of the Sea isn't just about looking at what God did for the Israelites. It's a reminder of how we can respond when we see Him move in our own lives. Worship isn't just about singing songs. It's about centering our hearts on God, remembering His goodness, and letting His power shape how we step forward. For the Israelites, this moment of collective worship was transformative. It wasn't simply the end of their story in Egypt, it was the beginning of their identity as a people completely dependent on God. It gave them courage, hope, and a renewed sense of faith to face what lay ahead. But this was just the beginning of their journey. The wilderness still waited, and with it, lessons that would shape their understanding of what it meant to trust God in every step. Lessons from the wilderness. Why does God often lead us into the wilderness after a victory? It's a question that feels almost backward, doesn't it? You would expect triumph to be followed by celebration and ease, not another challenge. Yet that's exactly what happened for the Israelites. No sooner had they crossed the Red Sea with their enemy vanquished behind them than they found themselves stepping into the unknown. The wilderness stretched out before them, a vast barren place with no clear resources, no comforts, and seemingly no direction. Their journey wasn't over. In some ways it was just beginning. The desert of Shur was their first stop, and it wasted no time testing their faith. After 3 days of traveling without water, the initial joy of their miraculous escape began to wear thin. When they finally came to a place called Mara, the water there was bitter and undrinkable. This sparked the first of many grumblings against Moses, and by extension against God Himself. "What shall we drink?" the people demanded. It's one of the most human responses imaginable when basic needs aren't met, fear takes over. Yet God didn't rebuke them, instead He provided a solution. At His command, Moses threw a piece of wood into the water, and it became sweet and safe to drink. This moment, though seemingly small compared to the parting of the Red Sea, was critical. It set the tone for what the wilderness would be, a place where their complete dependence on God would be tested, over and over again. But the challenges didn't stop there. After water, it was hunger. "Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt," they complained, "when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full." The familiarity of Egypt, harsh as it had been, seemed better in their minds than the uncertainty of the wilderness. Isn't that how we so often feel? Even after a breakthrough, when we're called to trust God again in the unknown, it's tempting to romanticize the past simply because it feels safer than the present. The Israelites couldn't yet see that the wilderness, while difficult, was serving a larger purpose. God's response to their hunger wasn't punishment or anger, it was provision. Manna appeared every morning like dew on the ground, a fine, flake-like substance they could gather and eat. It wasn't a feast, it wasn't glamorous, but it was enough, every single day. This daily bread was a profound lesson in trust. God was teaching them to rely on Him, not just on the big days when seas are parted, but every single day, even in the small, quiet moments. They couldn't store up the manna or save it for tomorrow. They had to wake up and trust God afresh each morning to meet their needs. It was a rhythm, a daily reminder that their survival came from His hand alone. This hit at the very core of their transformation. The Red Sea had freed their bodies, but their hearts and minds still carried the shadows of slavery. The wilderness wasn't just about moving them geographically, it was about reforming them spiritually. In Egypt, they had learned to rely on human systems, even when those systems oppressed them. But in the wilderness, there were no systems, there was only God. It was as if the wilderness stripped away everything they thought they could rely on, so that they would learn to lean entirely on Him. This wasn't punishment, it was preparation. Think about the challenges they faced. They were moments of thirst, moments of hunger, moments of overwhelming doubt about the journey. Each challenge wasn't just random hardship, it carried a deeper purpose. When they cried out for water again, in Exodus 17, God instructed Moses to strike a rock, and water poured forth. It wasn't just about quenching their thirst, it was about showing them, again and again, that God could provide in the most unexpected ways. And isn't that the lesson we often need? In the wilderness seasons of our lives, when we feel empty, God teaches us that He can bring provision from places we didn't think to look. Rocks don't produce water, yet God made it happen. Seas don't split open, yet here they were, living proof that they had. But the wilderness also exposed something deeper, their hearts. It wasn't just about learning to trust God, it was about facing the deeper realities of who they were. As the journey stretched on, their impatience grew. They wanted assurance, predictability, comfort. It's why they eventually turned to the golden calf at Mount Sinai, desperate for something tangible, something they could control. That moment revealed not just the fragility of their faith, but how God responds to failure. Even when they turned away from Him, God demonstrated mercy. As Moses would later recount, God revealed Himself as merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. The wilderness was not about perfection, it was about formation, learning who God is and who they were meant to become in relationship with Him. The Red Sea crossing set the stage for this dependence. That event had shown them that God could do the impossible, but the wilderness taught them that trust isn't just for the big, dramatic moments, it's for the everyday ones. Deliverance might come in miraculous winds or pillars of fire, but so often it looks more like manna, something small, something daily, something that calls us to live one day at a time. The Israelites needed to experience the wilderness so that when they reached the promised land, they would have faith rooted not in their own strength, but in God's. So, why does a wilderness often follow a breakthrough? Why do we find ourselves in barren stretches right after moments of victory? Sometimes it's because God is preparing us for where He's leading us next. Breakthroughs are transformational, but they don't always mean we're ready for what's ahead. The Israelites had to recognize that freedom wasn't just walking out of Egypt, it was becoming the people of God, fully dependent on Him. The wilderness was the ground where that transformation happened. It was where their doubts surfaced, where their old ways of thinking were challenged, and where God met them in their needs. And isn't that true for us too? After we experience God's faithfulness, it doesn't take long before life brings a new challenge. Sometimes those challenges feel like setbacks, but what if they're part of the plan? What if they're the in between space God uses to solidify the faith we'll need for what's still ahead? The good news is that God doesn't leave us alone in the wilderness. Just as He provided for the Israelites with manna, water, and His guiding presence, He does the same for us. The beauty of the wilderness is that it refines us. It strips away what we thought we needed and teaches us what truly sustains us. It removes false comforts and calls us back to God. The Israelites didn't love the wilderness, and let's be honest, none of us do. But it's in those barren, uncomfortable places that God does some of His most profound work. It's where He teaches us that He's enough and that His promises can be trusted. What did the Israelites learn? They learned that God's provision doesn't depend on human logic or resources. They learned that faith grows not just in moments of clarity, but in moments of uncertainty. And most importantly, they learned that the wilderness wasn't permanent. The Israelites weren't meant to stay there forever. It was a passage towards something greater, not a punishment for what was behind. For them, the wilderness was preparation for the promised land. So when we face wilderness seasons in our own lives, we can remember this: God is still at work. The same God who parted the Red Sea, who brought manna from heaven and water from a rock, walks with us in those moments too. Deliverance isn't just about leaving something behind, it's about the journey towards something better, and each step in the wilderness, though difficult, prepares us for what's ahead. God's power in our lives today. Could your impossible situation be the setup for God's next miracle? The story of the Red Sea crossing is more than just an ancient event, it's a reminder that God works powerfully in the lives of His people, even today. When the Israelites found themselves trapped with an impassable sea ahead and a pursuing army behind, fear took hold. It's easy to read this story and focus on the miraculous moment, but before the glory came the doubt, the panic, and the temptation to give up. Doesn't that mirror the challenges we still face? Those moments when we feel cornered by life, when there's no visible way forward and we're left wondering, what now? The Red Sea wasn't just about water parting, it was about God proving that the obstacles which feel overwhelming to us are opportunities for Him to show His power. Think about the situations that feel like your own Red Sea. Maybe it's a health diagnosis that you never saw coming, a financial crisis that feels too big to manage, or a relationship that seems beyond repair. Like the Israelites, it's easy to feel trapped, unsure of how things could possibly improve. But the story of Exodus 14 reminds us that the impossible is often the very stage God uses to display His glory. Fear and doubt so often come right before God moves in extraordinary ways. Imagine the Israelites standing at the edge of the sea, their only options seeming to be drowning or capture. From their perspective, it must have felt hopeless. But Scripture shows us that it's in those hopeless moments that God does His most transformative work. Sometimes it's only when all other options have been stripped away that we're able to see Him clearly. One example of this is Moses' statement to the Israelites, "Fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord." He wasn't promising that their situation would solve itself. Instead, he was pointing them toward God, toward the one who could rescue them in ways they couldn't begin to anticipate. What if the same principle holds true today? Think about the moments in your own life when you faced what felt like an insurmountable obstacle. Maybe you remember the emotions that came with it, the fear, confusion, or even anger. It's so easy to focus on the size of the problem that we forget the size of our God. But just as Moses stretched out his staff in faith, trusting God to act, we're called to take those steps of faith even when we can't see how things will work out. Faith doesn't mean we'll always know what's coming next. It means trusting that God will make a way, even when there seems to be no way at all. Modern testimonies are filled with stories that reflect this same truth. For example, countless people have shared how they trusted God through situations that seemed hopeless, situations where they lost a job, faced a terminal illness, or endured years of family conflict. In one case, a man spoke about losing everything in a flood, seeing his home and belongings wiped out in an instant. At first, he felt abandoned by God, but over the months that followed, he began to notice the community rallying around him. Strangers provided food, clothing, and even temporary housing. He eventually said, "Losing my home was devastating, but it also opened my eyes to how powerfully God can provide through people." Another example comes from someone battling stage 4 cancer. Every medical test pointed to a grim outcome, and yet she clung to her faith. She said later that her prayer wasn't just for healing, but for the strength to trust God no matter what happened. Her cancer eventually went into remission, baffling her doctors. But what stayed with her was the peace she felt during the hardest moments. She said, "The miracle wasn't just in my healing, it was in knowing God was with me the whole time." These stories echo the same lesson from the Red Sea. God's deliverance doesn't always look how we expect, but it reveals His presence unmistakably. Faith before the miracle is what aligns us with God's timing and power. Moses didn't know exactly how the Red Sea would part, but he obeyed God's command to stretch out his hand and his staff. That act of faith became the starting point for the miracle. In our own lives, faith often works the same way. It's not about knowing every step of the plan. It's about trusting God to walk with us as the plan unfolds. How does this play out today? It might mean stepping forward in faith to repair a broken relationship, even when it feels like trying will only lead to more hurt. It could mean continuing to pray for provision during a financial struggle, even when the bank account is empty. Or it might look like choosing joy and gratitude despite facing difficult circumstances. In all these situations, faith calls us to act, not because we can see the solution, but because we trust the God who provides it. The Red Sea story also reminds us that God is still in the business of parting seas. What impossibilities have you labeled as permanent? Maybe it's the belief that you'll always struggle with anxiety, or that you'll never make it out of debt. Maybe it's the feeling that your situation is too complex for God to fix. But Scripture tells us otherwise. The God who parted the Red Sea is the same God who can create a path through whatever storm you're facing. He doesn't ignore impossible situations, He transforms them. Of course, trust isn't always easy. The Israelites stood at the shore of the Red Sea with fear in their hearts, and we often feel the same when obstacles rise before us. But faith doesn't demand that we erase our fear. It asks us to keep moving forward in spite of it. When the Israelites stepped into the seabed, they couldn't know for sure how things would end. The path ahead wasn't clear beyond where the waters had parted, but every step forward said, "We trust you, God." Every footfall on that dry ground was another declaration of faith, another moment of believing in what they couldn't yet see. That same trust transforms our lives today. Faith isn't something passive, it's not just a thought or a feeling, it's the activation of our trust in God's promises. When we choose to lean into that trust, even in the face of obstacles, we create space for God's power to move. Challenges that once seemed immovable begin to shift, opportunities that seemed closed off begin to open, and those moments of fear that once dominated our vision are replaced by the realization that God's hand has been at work all along. The truth is that the Red Sea isn't just a story, it's an invitation. It's a call to see your life through the lens of God's faithfulness. Those walls of water weren't just physical barriers, they represented every limit the Israelites thought they had. And when they fell, it showed them that God's power was greater than any obstacle they'd faced. The same is true today. Whatever feels like a barrier in your life, whatever feels like it could never change, is an opportunity for God to display His glory. He hasn't stopped making a way, He hasn't stopped showing up for those who trust Him. So, what does it look like to trust God in the face of the impossible? It might not feel grand or significant at first. It might start with a single prayer, a single step forward, or a single decision to believe that He is with you. Like the Israelites stepping into the path through the sea, it's more about obedience and trust than about understanding everything ahead. Faith activates God's power, transforming obstacles into opportunities for His glory. And when you look back, you'll see His fingerprints all over your story. The God who parted the sea hasn't changed. He is the same today as he was then. His power hasn't diminished, and neither has his care. No matter what you're facing, remember this: your impossible situation might just be his setup for the miraculous. Trust him, step forward, and watch as he creates a path you never thought possible. What to do when you feel trapped? When you're cornered by fear, what's your next move? It's a question we've all faced, whether in moments of crisis or uncertainty. The story of the Israelites at the edge of the Red Sea gives us a vivid picture of this tension. An enemy too powerful to face was closing in behind them, and what looked like an impenetrable sea stretched before them. Panic erupted in the camp. They cried out in fear, regretting ever leaving Egypt and questioning Moses' leadership. Yet, Moses stood firm in that moment, responding not with panic but with faith. Do not be afraid. Stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. Those words weren't just for the Israelites in that moment, they echo into our own lives today, guiding us when we face our own Red Sea moments. It's easy to read this story and imagine ourselves in Moses' position, declaring faith boldly, but most of us have times where we feel more like the Israelites. Fear can be paralyzing, convincing us that there's no way out of whatever challenges we're facing. Maybe it's the fear of losing a job, the uncertainty of where rent will come from next month, or a diagnosis that shakes your entire world. Whatever form it takes, fear often grabs hold of us and narrows our vision. Like the Israelites, we can find ourselves focusing so much on the Pharaoh chasing us that we lose sight of the one leading us. That's the tension we all experience, the pull between fear and faith. Fear makes us desperate to grab control, to find immediate answers, or rush into decisions without thinking. Faith, on the other hand, asks us to wait, to trust that God has something beyond what we can see. But how do we practically choose faith when fear feels overwhelming? What does it actually look like to take Moses' advice, to stand firm and trust in God's deliverance? One of the first steps is understanding that faith isn't about denying your fear. It's about choosing to trust God in the midst of it. Moses didn't tell the Israelites their fear was invalid. After all, Pharaoh's army was genuinely powerful and the sea was undeniably there. What Moses did was shift their focus. He reminded them that their help wasn't coming from their own strength but from God. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent. Those words challenge us too. How often do we try to fight battles that aren't ours to fight? When we feel trapped, it's tempting to throw ourselves into problem-solving mode, scrambling for any solution we can find. But Moses offers another way: stillness, silence, waiting on God. Standing firm doesn't mean doing nothing. It means choosing not to let fear dictate your decisions. It's like stopping in a raging storm, refusing to be swept away by the chaos, and grounding yourself in the truth of who God is. But let's be honest, waiting on God is one of the hardest things to do. When life presses in on all sides, choosing to pause and trust often feels counterintuitive. That's why it's so important to ground yourself in Scripture, to remind yourself of God's promises. In Exodus 14, we see God's character on full display: faithful, powerful, and present. Reflecting on how God delivered the Israelites can encourage us to trust Him with our own impossible situation. Think about the practical ways you can stand firm during a difficult season. If you're facing a financial crisis, standing firm might mean trusting God enough to share your struggles with someone who can help, even if it's humbling. It might mean choosing not to make decisions out of panic, but bringing every detail to God in prayer. If you're dealing with health challenges, standing firm could look like clinging to Scripture that speaks of God's faithfulness, even when you feel weak or uncertain. For those navigating grief or heartbreak, it might involve leaning into community, letting others remind you of God's goodness when it's hard to see it for yourself. Standing firm also means remembering times when God has been faithful before. The Israelites were only weeks removed from witnessing the plagues that devastated Egypt and forced Pharaoh to release them, yet their fear caused them to forget how God had already acted on their behalf. That can happen to us too. When faced with new difficulties, we often forget the times God has provided, guided, or protected us in the past. Take time to reflect on your own Red Sea moment, those seasons where, even if it wasn't immediate, God made a way for you. Sometimes just remembering what He's already done is enough to restore your confidence for what He can do next. Faith in the face of fear isn't passive, though. It challenges us to actively trust God and step forward, even when we don't understand how things will work out. The Israelites still had to move, still had to walk into the parted waters on dry ground. Imagine the first few steps, the uncertainty, the fear of what might happen if the walls of water collapsed. Stepping forward wasn't easy, but every step they took was an act of trust, a declaration that they believed God would do what He had promised. In the same way, trust is often a call to action in our lives too. It might mean taking that step to forgive someone, even if reconciliation feels impossible. It might mean pursuing a new opportunity, even when doubt looms. It might just mean continuing to show up day after day, despite feeling overwhelmed by your circumstances. Choosing faith over fear transforms how we see the challenges in front of us. When we trust God, the things that seem like dead ends start to look like opportunities for Him to reveal His power. Instead of being defined by our obstacles, we become defined by the God who walks with us through them. But here's the thing, faith doesn't always eliminate fear immediately. The Israelites didn't suddenly stop feeling terrified the moment Moses spoke. Faith is built step by step, sometimes with trembling hands and shaky knees, but each step deepens our trust. The promise of Exodus 14 is that we don't have to face these moments alone. Just as God fought for the Israelites, He fights for us too. That doesn't always mean He'll part the sea in the way we expect. Sometimes it means giving us peace during a storm rather than removing it. Sometimes it means working behind the scenes in ways we can't yet see, but His presence is constant. The same God who stood as a pillar of fire between Israel and their enemies stands between you and the things you fear today. He knows the entire story, even when all we can see is the next step. So, what happens when we choose faith over fear? God's power is revealed. It might not always look like parting seas or dramatic rescues, but when we trust Him, He moves in ways that transform our lives. Often, it's not just the situation that changes, it's us. Facing our Red Sea moments can deepen our faith, drawing us closer to the God who holds all things in His hands. Standing still in faith is often the first step of seeing God's deliverance. It feels counterintuitive, especially when fear tells us to take control, but stillness gives God space to act. The Lord will fight for you, Moses said. That truth remains. When we surrender our need to control the outcome, we open the door for Him to do the impossible. Does surrender mean immediate resolution? Not always. Sometimes it means walking through the situation step by step, unsure of what lies ahead, but God is in every step, every moment, transforming fear and obstacles into testimonies of His faithfulness. As we reflect on the Red Sea story, let it remind us of this. Even when we feel trapped, God is not finished. Fear might cloud what's next, but faith opens the door to trust the one who knows the way. The Israelite story reminds us that just as God made a way through the sea, He still makes ways for us today. Conclusion. The parting of the Red Sea isn't just a story, it's a reminder that God transforms the impossible into a testimony of His power. When the Israelites faced what seemed like certain defeat, God showed them there was still a way forward, a path only He could create. The next time you feel trapped, remember, God's not finished. Your obstacle might just be His setup for glory. Is there a sea in your life waiting to be parted? Trust Him, step forward, and watch as the impossible unfolds. Sometimes the greatest miracles come when we choose faith over fear.